All right, Becky, it looks like the participants coming into the webinar has slowed down a bit. Do you think we're good to start?
Yep, go for it.
Awesome. All right, so next slide. Maybe. If someone's switching the slide, I can't see it. But welcome everyone to our webinar today on prison gerrymandering reform. We are so happy that all of you have joined us today. If you would like to, if you could put your name, your pronouns, and your state into the chat, that would be great so we can see where everyone is zooming in from. And then next slide. Great, and so here is the agenda for today. We are going to talk about what prison gerrymandering is, some of the impacts that it has on racial equity in states. We'll have some information on reform solutions, some time for Q&A, and then we'll go into breakout sessions for about 10 to 15 minutes. They will be self-selected breakouts, so you can choose whichever you'd like to learn more about, but it'll be states that have passed or are implementing reform, and then states that have not passed reform, but are just interested in learning more. And then we'll have a brief report back, maybe some next steps, and close out our training. Next slide. Great. And so we have a chat that or a poll, I believe, that's going to be in the chat. But if folks want to just share with us what your level of engagement for prison gerrymandering reform is, either very engaged, somewhat engaged, not engaged, or you're for and you have no idea what prison gerrymandering is. It is also now up on the screen, so you can select in the poll question. All right, and while we're waiting for the results from the poll from Becky, I realized that I did not introduce myself at the top of this call, so I can do that now. My name is Elena Langworthy. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Deputy Director of Policy with State Voices. And Becky, do we have the poll results? There we go. Great, so it looks like it's a real mix of folks, somewhat engaged. Seems like that's the representation here. But thank you all so much for participating in the poll. I will turn it now to Kathy Fang to talk more about what prison gerrymandering is.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kathy Fang, and I am from Common Cause. I'm stepping in for my colleague, Keisha Morris, this year, whose voice has been attacked by a bug, and she needs a little time to heal. So I'm going to do my best to represent all of the knowledge that Keisha's been accumulating over this time and all of the work that she's been doing, and ask apologies, or ask for forgiveness ahead of time, because I know that I'm not her equal in this area. Let's start a little bit with a question of what prison-based gerrymandering is. I think as a lot of people have come to become much more aware of the prison industrial complex and the problem with mass incarceration, particularly on communities of color, we have also learned that the way that we count people who are in prison, particularly for purposes of census counts and redistricting, can have a huge impact on how resources are distributed and how representation is allotted. And the practice right now is that we count people who are incarcerated in the places where the prisons are, as opposed to where their home community is. That practice is known as prison gerrymandering. It really distorts our democracy. And just to give kind of one small example, one of the first examples that I learned about was watching a fantastic video that Prison Policy Institute put together, where Peter Wagner is standing out in the snow. I'll bet you a lot of you may have seen this, in Anamosa, Iowa. And he talks about how this one individual runs for office, and he actually wins with 2 votes, not by 2 votes, not a margin of 2 votes, but exactly 2 votes that are cast for him, and he wins. Basically, the mayor and his wife voted for him. And how is that possible? Well, in this particular district in Anamosa, they have a federal prison, and the prison constitutes, that population constitutes most of that district's population. And so there's only a very small number of people who can vote and who do vote. And so he only needed to gather 2 votes in order to be able to win that office. That's a real problem, especially when you compare to, say, neighboring districts. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about what some of the impacts of prison-based gerrymandering are. It takes much needed resources and representation from the home communities of people in prison. It tends to boost the population of places where the large prisons are located. And in particular, if you look at what the racial impact is, people who are largely Black and brown, who are put into prison, are oftentimes taken away from their home communities and placed in places where the prisons are, which tend to be areas that are largely white and rural districts. According to the NAACP LDF, African Americans constitute about 41% of the prison and state population, and they're being put into rural communities and boosting the population so that rural communities that have prisons have about 40% of that population that's boosted. And so what we're really seeing is a kind of distortion where people are displaced from their home communities, where those communities aren't getting the resources that they need, both to ensure that they're creating much better opportunities for people so they don't go to prison, but also when they come back, they're not able to receive and be able to bring people back into society, reintegrate them. Next slide. So this is a hypothetical that sort of displays how prison-based gerrymandering works. So in our hypothetical, we've got 4 different districts, and each one hypothetically has 100 people, mostly because my math needs to be simple so that I understand it. And in those 4 districts, if one of those districts, the rural pink district, has a prison, and 20 of those people that are counted in that area are prisoners, then that means that the 80 permanent residents of the pink district have a much larger weight in their vote and frankly their resources that they can receive because the prisoners are counted in their district, but those prisoners cannot vote. They can't engage in a lot of civic activities that people who are permanent residents could. And by contrast, if many of those prisoners happen to come from, let's say, the neighboring blue district, then those people are actually deprived of those residents when it comes to counting. We see that time and time again. In a report that was produced by Common Cause Illinois, it talked about how in Illinois, some 60% of people who are incarcerated in state and federal penitentiary are actually people from Chicago. But at the same time, 90% of those people are put into districts that are downstate. And here are some local examples, and you can see how distorted that becomes. A county like LaSalle has in its 6th district a prison, and 34% of the people in that 6th district are incarcerated, right? Meaning that the remaining people, the 66 residents of that district, have an outsized voting power compared to 100 residents in any other district. Similarly, in Minnesota, we can see that there are counties like Waseca that have a large prison, and so those people who live there have an outsized representation. Next slide. and in Georgia and Pennsylvania, example after example. And we could go through any states in the country and find examples where the rural counties that have a large disproportionate number of the prisons have an outsized vote and are able to supplement their population with that prison population. In fact, in Pennsylvania, after the 2000 census, there were 8 Pennsylvania districts that didn't have enough people to meet the ideal number required by the constitutional's equal population requirements, right, when it was redistricting. But because of prison gerrymandering, they had that extra population that boosted their population to be able to change their lines very little because they met the population threshold. Next slide. I think a lot of people have analogized prison-based gerrymandering to something akin to the 2/5 rule from the founding times of our country, where African Americans were counted for purposes of representation in Congress, but were not given the ability to vote and were diminished in terms of the weight that they had in representation. I hand it over to my colleague Elena to continue the presentation. Oh, I'm sorry. Elena, this might be me. We'll go back. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits of reforming prison gerrymandering. Obviously, if we were to count people who are in prison, not where the prison is located, but in their home communities, it would ensure that the representation was far more accurate. And in fact, actually, the Census Bureau has already started to do this with other populations, like military who are based overseas, are no longer just removed from the census count. They actually have been looking at records and figuring out what's your home community, and how do we make sure that when you come back home, those communities have the resources to be able to receive you. And in similar ways, when we reform prison gerrymandering, we can ensure that the home communities have the resources to be able to take care of people who are returning from prison. It also ends the unfair extraction of people, resources, and representation from those communities, which tend to be more urban and more diverse. And it ends the maldistribution and the vote dilution, where some communities, rural ones that have prisons, that tend to have prisons, won't have gained power at the expense of others. And that really is an issue that it kind of cuts both ways. It's not that one party benefits or another. It really is a matter of making sure that there's just an accurate count and accurate distribution of power. I'm just going to say one last piece, which is, and I think Elena will talk much more about this. When we think about people who are incarcerated and the total disproportionate number of people who are people of color, Black and brown people who are incarcerated, when they return to their home communities, making sure that they have the full protection and representation of government is incredibly important. Making sure that the resources are there to receive them, making sure that we think about policies that really represent people who might be incarcerated is so important, and that can't happen as long as there's prison gerrymandering. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Elena Langworthy.
Now it's my turn. Great. So just as Kathy mentioned, prison gerrymandering really impacts democracy as a whole and representation throughout a state, but it also heavily impacts issues for racial equity. Oh, I see the slides. Okay. So as we know, based on previous reported data, Black people are incarcerated at a rate 5 times higher than white people. However, prisons do tend to be located in white rural communities. In fact, the Prison Policy Initiative, who we are fortunate to have with us on the webinar today, found that 60% of new prisons are actually constructed in rural areas, and that those areas in rural communities make up just 20% of the country's population. So bit of a different population in where the prisons are versus who the prisoners are. Incarcerated people, for the most part, tend to come from dense and urban communities of color. And that, in effect, has really padded out the population data for prison counties to provide more political representation for those counties and districts. And the home counties in which the incarcerated people are coming from, have homes and families in, see either a decline or a stagnation in their overall representation. So they're not being able to build the political power because of the prison gerrymandering. For some examples, onto the next slide, here we go. At the national level, the last round of redistricting in 2011, there were 161 prison districts across 31 states that had an incarcerated people of color population that outnumbered the actual people of color population in each respective district, meaning that the majority of the people of color population were actually in prisons and jails where they were not accessing any of the county resources or facilities, but they were, in prison and really skewing the racial makeup of the counties and districts. Other examples of the overinflation for racial makeup. A 2019 Cambridge University study found that in Pennsylvania, if all of the prisoners in the state had been counted in their home districts, 4 of the majority white non-metro, aka rural state assembly districts would no longer meet the minimum population threshold to be considered districts. And then the second example here is from a recent New York Times article, and I think something that Kathy also spoke on, but in Illinois, nearly half of the state's prison population have home addresses in Cook County or Chicago, but they make up close to 90% of the residents in prisons across the state. And again, according to PPI, the majority of prisoners in Illinois either identify as Latinx or Black. That would be 7 out of 10 inmates identify as one of the 2 races, but they're located in prisons that are in counties that are 85% white. And so again, I think the data, and we could spend more time on this, but the data really kind of points to the fact that this is an issue not just for representation as a whole, but the racial equity of our communities of color in urban areas. And so now with that, I will open it up for some Q&A time. If folks have, and Kathy just put in the information into the chat about Anamosa, Illinois. If folks have questions, or I'm sorry, I think I'm going to pass to Alex now. I will pass to Alex for her presentation on prison gerrymandering reform options in states.
So, hi everybody, I'm Alex Keister, the Prison Policy. I'm the legal director at the Prison Policy Initiative. And for over 10 years, we've been working with local and state governments to try to ameliorate the impact of prison gerrymandering, as well as putting pressure on the Census Bureau to just get people counted in the right place in the first place, so that it wouldn't become a burden onto localities and states that should fix the problem. And folks like you all having to do this all piecemeal by yourselves. So as Kathy mentioned, a good place to start is, the story of Anamosa, as Kathy mentioned, because the local governments like city councils, county commissions, they were the first ones at the forefront of trying to find a solution to prison gerrymandering, because as the Anamosa example demonstrates, at that level of government, just a single state facility can have a huge impact on your district. Danny Young, he was a backhoe operator, the guy who got elected. And as you might have noticed, neither of one of those votes were his. He wasn't even running. So when he won, the mayor basically had to call him up and be like, hey, so this happened, like, will you serve? And he did. And one of his main priorities while on the council was to change the way that they've set up their government to eliminate prison gerrymandering. And in other cities and counties, this was even more obvious. It didn't come to that because they would draw their lines, and if they included the prison population, that was all pretty much out of town residents in their resident population, they would end up with a district that was all incarcerated, or several districts that were incarcerated. So they basically be drawing a plan that had empty seats on their town government, on the county government. So they realized very early on that the census numbers didn't reflect the local population, that they needed to be adjusted. And so the solution at the city or county level is fairly crude. The city just doesn't have much jurisdiction to do anything else. So what they can do is just remove that state prison from their population count. And what we've seen when looking at address data in the
I think Alex might be having some Wi-Fi issues right now. Let's see if we can give her a second. And Kathy, if you're talking, I think you're also on mute.
While we're waiting, I was going to say we could remind folks, if you've got questions or if you're looking for resources that could be helpful, you can pop those questions into the chat, and we'll try to be sure to answer them as we go along.
Sorry, we're having some storms pass through, so I just lost internet. Where was the last thing that you guys heard?
Possibility to remove prison populations from districts.
Thanks, Keisha. Yeah, so when these county and city districts were looking at a solution, they had to be fairly crude in the way they solved it. And they basically just removed the prison population, which we found in the places where we had access to people's home addresses. We found that this is a pretty near match for determining the actual population of your town, that at most a handful of people in that state facility would be from the town. And so that falls obviously well within the allowable population deviations to reach equality. Once you move up to the state level of reform, this is where you can be a bit more precise. So what states can do is do what we call reallocation. So they get the home address data from the departments of corrections, map that data in a way that makes it compatible with census data, and basically create an adjusted data file that they can use for redistricting. That will, in effect, undo the Census Bureau's miscount and count everybody at home. Using that data file, they can draw their districts as if everybody were counted at home. The kind of roadblocks to implementation that crop up is the quality of the address data that the departments of corrections have. Oftentimes that needs to get cleaned up, even if it on its face kind of looks like, oh, everybody has an address. Once you start mapping it, you might realize 123 Main Avenue doesn't exist. It's obviously 123 Main Street, but that's not something that software can usually tell you. So it requires a certain amount of manual cleanup. Some addresses are incomplete at all, like the town's missing. And then, sometimes you can guess things based on, like, if you have the zip code but not the town, you can kind of guess where it is. If it's a unique street name, you can kind of guess where it is, but that all takes time. So when you're looking at implementing the reforms that have already been passed in those states that have these laws that require reallocation, there's still things to watch for. As this process unfolds and as the mapping takes place, there are several places where the state can get tripped up. So as advocates, what you kind of, the best use of your time is looking at what's going on, making sure that it is happening, but also moderating expectations for the folks behind the scenes that are doing this data reallocation. Oftentimes, folks using this data aren't used to working with data of such low quality, let's say. And it's, they get nervous that, oh, they can't reallocate everybody. And it's really good to set expectations that like 100% reallocation is not feasible in most states. I think probably California and Maryland might come closest this decade, but states like Nevada might not even reach 60% reallocation. Montana's looking at doing reallocation just starting now with no legislation in place. They're probably going to have a really low reallocation rate if they decide to go through with it. So reallocation is one solution. The next solution that you can do if your state doesn't have legislation in place already, and for one reason or another, reallocation is impractical, you can look at the census data itself. The Census Bureau this decade is publishing a separate table that they've added onto the PL data. So the PL data is what's usually used in redistricting. PL 94-171 is what it's called. It refers to the statutory requirement the Bureau produce this data. And in this table, it's called a group quarters table. Group quarters are places that the Census Bureau counts people that aren't like typical households. So it's people that live together that aren't related or in other household situation. And in that are basically prison populations. So any state, as they're redistricting, can keep that data in mind while they're drawing the districts so that they don't accidentally engage in prison gerrymandering. And then they can ameliorate some of the impact of the prison populations. So for example, if you're drawing a district that's kind of already on the line has like barely enough people to warrant a district, if it contains several correctional facilities, then it would likely just fall right under that constitutionally permissible population requirement. So what you can do is basically keep an eye on all the numbers. Make sure that all your districts have enough population to warrant a district without counting the prison populations in them. And you can kind of do this two ways. One is use the kind of permissible population deviations to counteract the prison populations. So you have, a district that's where the prison accounts for 5% of the population, have that district be 5% overpopulated, so that when you look at the actual population of the district, it's much closer to the ideal. Obviously, you can't do this in some states that have where the districts have small populations and the prisons have large populations. You just can't completely eliminate prison gerrymandering within the population deviations. But what you can do is make sure you don't make it any worse. And you can do this in most states. Some states, the geography just doesn't work, and which is to split as many prisons as you can among separate districts. So if you have two prisons next to each other, try to run a line between them rather than putting them both in the same district. In Massachusetts, this is the state approach here, where I live. The Massachusetts Redistricting Committee decided that our state constitution doesn't allow them to adjust the census data. But they took this approach of just making sure that they drew the lines between the prisons because they're fairly displaced in Massachusetts. It worked really well to really limit the impact of prison gerrymandering. They cut the worst affected districts by about half. And that can be, of course, combined with the population deviations approach of get the prisons spread out as much as you can between the districts, and then use those allowable population deviations to really tamp down on the impacts of the prisons. And this is something that Rhode Island takes this approach as well. They have, and the geography there actually doesn't work in their favor. They have a massive prison complex. The state has put all of its correctional facilities just within a few blocks of each other. And they managed to run, I think, 3 districts through there. It could have been done slightly better, but you know, doing that is better than not. And then the other important thing about implementation in this redistricting cycle, about getting reform done, is really now is the time to start thinking about 2030. Anything that you can do now to start preparing for the 2030 cycle will be very beneficial, because states that are looking at starting something now are really starting off on the back foot in terms of you just need to deal with the data you have. If you're looking at 2030, make sure the Departments of Corrections are talking with your redistricting commissions, getting their data needs addressed. If you start collecting, because of the churn that we have in the prison system, if you start collecting addresses basically on intake now, you'll have a nearly complete data set by 2030. And one final note that I wanted to make is on, when we're talking about equalizing the representation and resources, this is something like a quick knee-jerk reaction that usually happens when people advocate for ending prison gerrymandering is folks say, well, our poor rural town, we really need this funding that comes with the prison populations because it increases our road traffic and we have to provide ambulance services and all sorts of things. So it's really important to be ready for that talking point and how to address it. And first, it's good to know that funding allocations, when we're talking about resources, we're really talking about 2 things. 1, funding formulas, and 2, the shift in legislative priorities from which funding flows and which communities are prioritized. And in terms of funding formulas, nowadays, they're, for the most part, really well tailored to their specific needs. So there are, I guess, 2 points to make here. 1 is when a state addresses prison gerrymandering by even reallocating the incarcerated folks back to their home addresses for redistricting purposes, that is a redistricting data set that you're working with. That will have no impact on funding. Any funding formulas won't look to that data set. And secondly, even if the Census Bureau were to change where incarcerated people are counted, the funding formulas are so tailored now that would have very minimal, if any, impact on the kind of funding flows. Because when you're talking about the census, having just gone through it, I'm sure everybody heard, be counted, it means community money for your community. And you get this every person counted is $1,800 a head. But that's a really crude estimate that's basically done by which funding formulas mention census in any capacity, how much money flows through them, divided by the number of people in the country. But of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with funding schools in your state. That goes per pupil, or it's a needs-based assessment. Highway funding is often tied to highway mileage. So where incarcerated people are counted doesn't often impact the funding formulas. And so what we're really talking about is resources flowing from an appropriate allocation of representation, shifting, making sure that the legislature represents the needs of the people, where people are actually living, where their communities are. So yeah, I guess that's a heads up to not get sucked into these like funding formula talking points that I'm sure will come up anytime you start talking about this. And I think now we can go back to Q&A. And Alina.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. +1 on the funding formula observation that can just lead down a huge rabbit hole. If folks have questions, if you want to put them in the chat now, I'm not seeing many, but I can go and look back up. A question from Jen. For folks who are residing in states that currently prohibit prison gerrymandering, what are efforts that can be done to help other states prohibit prison gerrymandering either now or in the next census?
So the biggest thing you can do is after each redistricting cycle is done for the states, the Census Bureau kind of behind the scenes reaches out to the redistricting authorities there. And because when I mentioned that PL data comes from a statutory requirement to provide that data, it's actually a statutory requirement to provide the data because the Census Bureau is required to work with the states to provide them useful redistricting data. So when enough states complain that the data provided by the Census Bureau is not in fact useful for redistricting, that they've had to go through this whole process of counting everybody back at home, that will be really useful to put extra pressure on the Census Bureau to change the way that they count incarcerated people in 2030. And to set up at the very least, to set up other resources for states doing this. After the last decade with New York and Maryland doing the reallocation, in Massachusetts complaining to the Census Bureau that they were forced to do their solution. The Census Bureau put in place that the extra table where they'll actually provide the correctional population data in with the redistricting data, and they've made a geocoder available to the states to run basically address files that are much larger than they've ever let anybody else run. So that kind of pressure from the redistricting authorities will be very useful if you can get them to relay that information to the Census Bureau.
Yeah, I think I'm going to add a couple of ideas. So one piece is on an advocacy level. It is to find voices and heroes who can give a real face to the impact of this kind of prison gerrymandering. If that means, talking with communities that support people who are coming out of prison, talking about the resources that they need, talking about the lack of representation, that's one piece. Another piece is to do research. There's a lot of reports that have been done preceding big pieces of legislation that have really, I think, sharpened the focus on what the impact is in those states. And so we popped some of those examples into the chat. And I think what's important is that it kind of also puts numbers and quantitative data behind what the problem is so that people who are in decision-making power can see what the impact is. And finding, legislators or, city council members or county members who look at that issue and realize the inequity behind it, can kind of talk to both people who are impacted, but also have numbers behind them, give them the kind of policy arguments that they might need to be able to introduce legislation. And then the last thing, I think what Alex said before, preparing the data. So I think the Census Bureau is certainly one place that we should all be kind of leaning in to say, hey, you need to start asking this question in a way that allows for people to be reallocated back to their home, their last known address. But the other piece is that we learned this from Maryland's director of planning, who talked about how when Maryland decided that they were going to reallocate people back to their last known addresses, the problem was that reallocating was only as good as the data that the Department of Corrections was collecting. And the Department of Corrections wasn't necessarily thinking about what they should be collecting and, you know, how to consistently get people's addresses. They weren't thinking about this as a back end. But if one starts to build some of those practices in to what those departments are doing, people who come into contact with people who are formerly incarcerated or somewhere in the process, that the data that they're collecting on where their addresses are, what information we know about those people, it can be collected in a much more consistent way so that when the state decides to do the right thing and allocate people based on their home address, that they've actually got the data to do it and they're not scrambling to reconstruct something from lousy data that was not collected in the first place.
All right, I think we're right at time, but I'm going to ask one more question, I think, to Alex, and kind of incorporating two questions here that I see in the chat. Are there firms that specialize in integrating this reallocation data into the census data? What are the ways to get this reallocation data? And then there's a second question of, if a state does get address data from prisons for reallocation, what should the time periods cover for what they're requesting?
Right. So to the extent possible, you really want the address data to be reflective of the people that were incarcerated on April 1st, which is the reference date for the census itself, so that you have the closest match possible to the census data. Obviously, if you have data that's close to that, but not precisely that, you know, I think that goes under the theme of this decade. Do the best you can. That's closer than, you know, counting everybody in the wrong place. And I think I saw a question come by of like, you know, what if we have 20% of our people in private facilities? I know anybody who's in the Bureau of Prisons, the Bureau of Prisons is not cooperating with states for these data requests. So again, just like, do the best you can. Your addresses will be incomplete. Count as many people at home as you can, and then from there, they're kind of policy decisions. You can count everybody for whom you don't have an address, either at large or at the location of the facility. In terms of the vendors, I believe last decade, Latford did it all in-house. As Kathy just mentioned in the chat, Maryland is using Caliper. They seem to be happy with Caliper. When other states have reached out to Caliper, they've been quoted really, really high numbers. I think for reallocating about 900 people in Montana, they wanted $40,000. And they were the reason why Delaware had to delay their reallocation for a decade. I know Montana is now talking to Andy Beveridge and Moon Duchin from Andy has, I think I forget now what his redistricting like official company name is. Moon's at the MGGG lab. There are other folks that do this kind of reallocation. Because this is the first decade, we have so many states doing it. There aren't a lot of firms, obviously, with experience in exactly this. But yeah, Jeff, I just confirmed New York did it in-house.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, and I see New York is doing the reallocation work in-house. That might be an option for some states, maybe Caliper, if it's not cost prohibitive. A request to save the chat, I think we can do that. If Becky, can we go to the next slide? All right, so we're gonna go quickly now into some breakouts for about 8 minutes. We'll have groups 1 and 2 that are states that have passed or are implementing reform, and you can see those states up on the screen. Next slide. And then we'll have groups 3 and 4 who are states that have not passed reform and are just curious about this process moving forward. These are self-select groups, so if you feel strongly about being in either of the groups and want to hear more from some of these states, feel free to select yourself into one of those groups. We will have some breakout questions, which I think for time's sake, we can just share when folks get into the groups. But if you want to, Becky, just quickly go over. So we want to see what experiences or hurdles with implementation have occurred. The vendor process, what we were just talking about, how has that gone for states that have passed reform? And how your state is assigning people without the addresses, what that looks like to work with demographers for the implementation. And then for group 3 and 4, we want to know, has your state or has your organization thought about implementing local prison gerrymandering reform? Is your organization involved in local efforts? And then what are some of the challenges and opportunities that you see in your respective state? So again, a bit short on time, but let's give ourselves maybe 6 to 8 minutes for these short breakout sessions, and then we'll come back and do a very quick report out.